During Imre de Bel's time as commandant of Treblinka, no deceptive welcome speech was given to new arrivals about the necessity of showering or delousing to calm them down once they had disembarked from their cattle carts. Instead, upon a transport's arrival into Treblinka, the deportees would be immediately herded towards the station square, as Ukrainian guards would fire sporadically into the crowd from nearby rooftops. Once a horde had been forced through the gates, they would arrive into the sorting square, where they were confronted with a large sign, which read the following: Jews of Warsaw, attention! You are in a transit camp, from which you will be sent to a labour camp. In order to avoid epidemics, you must present your clothing and belongings for immediate disinfection. Gold, money, foreign currency, and jewellery should be deposited with the cashiers in return for a receipt. They will then be returned to you later when you present this receipt. Bodily cleanliness requires that everyone bathe before continuing the journey. Although a fairly lazy attempt at deceit, Bel's sign still provided those who had arrived into Treblinka with a slight sliver of hope, helping to suppress any plans of desperate last-minute resistance. Once a transport had been forced into the square, the SS and Ukrainian guards would separate the inmates, with women and children being directed into a barracks on the left, and the men being detained in a group on the right. The women and children would then be forced to undress and hand in their valuables to the quote-unquote cashier at the end of the undressing barracks. While Ibel's reign did rely largely on terror as a means to maintain control during processing, the cashier was a very clever mode of deceit, implying that the Jews would at some point get these goods back. Following their deposit of their valuables, the women and children were then herded up the tube, the long, narrow fenced path that led towards the gas chambers. While the women and children were being undressed and gassed, a handful of strong male Jews would be selected from the transports to work for the SS, by sorting belongings, moving bodies, or assisting in the extermination process. Such prisoners would be fated to a few extra days of life before they too would be executed and replaced with fresh prisoners. Chiel Wiernik was himself a prisoner who evaded death during the time in which his transport was being processed, by mingling, as he put it, with a group of Jews already working in the camp when he arrived. Wiernik's decision to move out of his transport group and join the Jews already working in Treblinka saved his life. There were many such cases of men doing a similar thing to Wiernik in the early days of Treblinka, given that during Ibel's time as commandant, the processing of new arrivals was far more chaotic, making it easier for people to slip out, as it were, of their transport group. Once the SS had finished selecting male Jews destined for heavy labour, and the women and children had been murdered, the men would also be forced to undress, herded into the tube, and make their final sprint towards the gas chambers. Once the Jews had entered the tube, the SS and Ukrainian guards would beat them with whips and iron bars to make them run as fast as possible towards the so-called showers. As the victims arrived at the entrance of the gas chambers, they would be greeted with the sight of Ivan Marchenko and his sidekick, Nikolai. Marchenko, or Ivan the Terrible, as he is more commonly known, was atop the list of every Nazi hunter following the end of the Second World War. Marchenko was a Ukrainian guard, or a travniki, as they were often called. The word travniki has its etymology in the fact that the majority of the Ukrainian guards who collaborated with the Germans in Operation Reinhardt were trained at the Treblinka concentration camp. This camp, located roughly 40 kilometers outside of Lublin, was initially a Soviet prisoner of war camp, and was later transferred into a site for Jewish forced labour, becoming a satellite of the Majdanek extermination camp. The majority of Travnikis who volunteered to help the SS were former Soviet prisoners of war, men that were granted a reprieve from likely starvation in exchange for their unquestioning collaboration with the Germans. Lots of the Travnikis were selected based upon their hatred of communists, Jews, or the fact that they belonged to the so-called Volksdeutsche, a term for ethnic Germans who did not possess German citizenship. At Treblinka, the Ukrainians were given basic ideological and military training and practiced commanding live groups of Jewish prisoners in preparation for their grisly work in Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka. Therefore, it is likely that Ivan Marchenko was trained at Treblinka before being reassigned to Treblinka, although it is unknown how and why he was granted his specific post of manning the gas chambers. But one can likely infer why when they learn of his personality. Marchenko and Nikolai manned the gas chambers of Treblinka, a job that says something about any man who is willing to perform such a task, and says a lot about anyone who appears to enjoy it. Marchenko, or Ivan the Terrible, is recalled as being unusually cruel, a sociopathic brute who would have revelled in the Derlevanger Brigade. Often wielding a sword, Ivan took great delight in mutilating the bodies of people, especially women, on their way into the gas chambers. As the victims were being crammed inside, Ivan would regularly slice at them with his sword, forcing them to move faster. Marchenko particularly enjoyed mutilating the genitals of men and women as they were crammed into the fake shower rooms. In a particularly striking testimony, Chiel Rajchmann recalls an incident concerning Ivan the Terrible, during the time he spent working in the so-called dentist team, a group of Jews whose job it was to remove any gold fillings from the teeth of the victims recently gassed. One day I was working with the dentist group, removing false teeth from the victims of the gas chambers. On one of these days, I was working with another Jew called Finkelstein, who was grabbed by Ivan as we worked. Ivan, laughing, took an industrial drill and stuck it up Finkelstein's backside, laughing as he tortured him. He threatened to kill Finkelstein if he did not stop screaming. We called him Ivan the Devil. What exactly happened to Ivan the Terrible after Treblinka, or the war for that instance, is still a mystery. A man named John Demjanjuk, who happened to have the same surname and a very similar appearance to Ivan, was for years falsely identified as Ivan the Terrible, but instead was later identified as being a man who had served during Operation Reinhard, but instead as a guard at the Sobibór extermination camp. Some accounts claim that Ivan was killed in the Treblinka revolt, or that he escaped justice via the rat lines, disappearing into the ether, never to be seen again. His fate has never been conclusively proven, and it is very possible that he fled, changed his identity, and lived out a life under the guise of a different name. Once Ivan and Nikolai had successfully crammed the Jews into each of their 3 gas chambers, which could hold 200 to 250 people, the doors would be locked and the lights turned off. At this point, the chambers were often remarked as falling silent, as the people inside knew that something was terribly wrong. Ivan, or Nikolai, would then start the engine of a former Red Army tank in the adjacent generator room. The fumes would then be funneled out of the engine into each of the 3 gas chambers. Testimonies and estimates vary on how long a gassing would take, but it is generally agreed that the victims would suffer anywhere between 15 minutes to half an hour, with the average time being around 20 minutes. Once the screaming had subsided and the chambers fell silent, Ivan the Terrible would signal to the Totenjuden, or the Jews of Death, who were men forced to assist the SS and Ukrainians in the extermination area. Following this signal, these Jews would open the doors at the back of the gas chambers to allow the removal of bodies. Before Heinrich Himmler's visit in 1943, the bodies of gas Jews would be hauled into large burial pits, either by 2 men carrying them or by an excavator transferred from Treblinka 1. Following the implementation of Action 1005 in 1943, the corpses would instead be burned, which is something that will be explored later on. A particularly interesting and very dark part of the murder process at Treblinka was the Jewish orchestra that would play during gassings. Much akin to how Sobibór would release large flocks of geese in parallel to a gassing to help overpower the screams of dying victims, Treblinka had a small Jewish orchestra that would play nearby. Abraham Kryszpicki noted the following: "As I stood near the quote-unquote shower at Treblinka, I discovered something new. 40 metres from the gas chambers, near the path where the Jews would be led to the showers, a small musical ensemble stood under a tree. 3 Jews with yellow patches, 3 musicians from stock they were, stood and played their instruments. They played enthusiastically. It was difficult to make out their repertoire. These were apparently the latest hit songs favoured by the Germans and Ukrainians.